Hey everyone, and welcome to a new episode of He's Not Wrong. I'm your host, Chad D. On July 5th, 1852, Frederick Douglass stood before a crowd in Rochester, New York, and said something really powerful. He said, "This 4th of July is yours, not mine. You may rejoice, I must mourn." Those words were spoken over 173 years ago, and today I want to talk about why they are still important. Because I've been reading this book, and I think it belongs in the hands of every person who has ever protested on a street corner with a sign, every single person who has ever been told to calm down and to work within the system, to uphold the status quo, and to every person who has ever wondered whether any of our efforts with protesting actually changes anything. The book is called A Protest History of the United States, and it's written by Gloria Browne-Marshall. Gloria is a constitutional law professor, and she is also the great-granddaughter, that's two greats, great-great-granddaughter of a woman named Eliza Bradshaw, who was enslaved in Kentucky. She was beaten until she bled, and one night she threw a pot of boiling water at the people who enslaved her, and they never touched her again. And that story is what opens the book, and once you understand why it opens there, everything else seems to make sense. The argument that I find at the center of this book that I really want you to hear is that America and the United States are not the same thing. America is the promise. It's the Declaration of Independence. It's the idea that all people are created equal. It's the Statue of Liberty with her arm in the air. The United States is the other half. The laws, the courts, the violence, the calculated division that has always been deployed against anyone who actually tries to collect on that promise. Protest in Gloria's framework is not anti-American. It's America fighting the other half. It's the only mechanism that has ever forced the United States to live up to what America promises. That argument reframes 500 years of history. It reframes Standing Rock. It reframes Bacon's Rebellion. It reframes what happened to Frederick Douglass and Nat Turner and Franny Lou Hammer and every Amazon warehouse worker who signed a union card, and it reshapes what is happening now, today in 2026, as No King's Day protests spread across the globe, as books are pulled from school libraries, as state legislatures pass divisive concept laws designed to decide what history children are allowed to know. This conversation, it's timely, it's super important, and I'm so happy that it is happening at the day after the last really important and large third No King's Day protest. So without further ado, I want to give you my conversation with the wonderful Gloria Browne-Marshall. Gloria Browne-Marshall, thank you so much for joining us on He's Not Wrong. I'm so excited for our conversation today. I just want to ask before we get started, how are you doing? How are things going for you?
I'm doing well, and the sun started coming out, so it's great.
Blue skies here. It was crazy. It was snowing on Monday. It was 80 degrees on Sunday, snowing on Monday, and now it's back to like 70s and 80s. So I'm so happy that the sun is out and it's blue skies and it's actually enjoyable now. So you released a book recently, A Protest History of the United States, and I am just so grateful that you're coming on to talk about that book with my audience today, because that book was so eye-opening. You call it a toolkit, and I believe very much so. It is a toolkit for people to understand their history, how protest is really important for our growth and progress as a nation. But you started the book with something that, I'm not being dramatic when I say this, it made me stop and think, and it really changed something in my DNA makeup. And it's this idea that there's the United States, and then there's this idea of America. And America is the promise of our rights. It's our freedom. It's our national anthem, the Statue of Liberty, all of these things that we think of the United States to be. That's America. And the United States is kind of the ugly sibling that's off to the side, that's doing things to hurt America. And it's through protest that the United States gets to live up to the promises and ideals that we know America to be. So I want to start out by asking how that idea came to you and what that means to you and how you're able to come up with that explanation, because I thought that was so moving.
Thank you. Yes, this idea of United States as empire builder, commerce capitalist twin to the Americas represented by Statue of Liberty and, liberty and justice for all, came to me because in my classes, we once discussed what is an American, and we couldn't come
Mm.
up with a real clear definition. So some people said, oh, it's about freedom. Someone else said, no, it's about money. And then I started really thinking, and then there were other suggestions as well, but I started thinking about this dichotomy, this conflict, this sense that this dualism, bipolarism. I don't want to, undermine anybody else's neurodivergence. But what I am concerned about is that we needed to put some words to it. And so when
Yeah.
I thought dueling twin, maybe that's the best
Yeah.
way to look at it, because the country begins in 1607 in Virginia. Even there's a dueling myth. We think it begins with the Pilgrims. And so we don't even
Mm.
have the idea of when the country started. It started in 1607 in Virginia as a business. There was a charter given by King James, the same King James version of the Bible. King James gave this charter to businessmen to start a colony in the New World. And that's what North and South America were considered the New World. And so they sent these ships over, but the people in the ship, the people who row in the boat, were people seeking freedom. They were seeking a way to break away from the caste system of Western Europe. And so we have the Irish and the English and all these lower classes and indentured servants thinking this is going to be a new start for them. So even in the very ship that begins the nation, that we think of our history beginning there, it was even conflicted then. There were the businessmen at the top, and the people were the ones seeking freedom. And so it's always been this conflict. Who are we? Are we just about money and enterprise,
Mm.
empire building, or are we about freedom, justice, and liberty? So that's an ongoing conflict. So I thought, why not figure out a way to get people to see it and help them to understand they're not confused, that there is actually a conflict here that's been there since the very beginning.
That is so poignant and such. I'm telling you, it truly did change something in me when I started thinking it a bit that way. Because part of me, and I've had a few guests come on, and we've talked about the 250th anniversary of America, and for our nation coming up on the July 4th, and I'm like, I'm not excited. I feel like I should be excited, but just with what's going on right now, like I'm conflicted. Do I celebrate? Do I not celebrate? And when I read that in your book, it just made sense in my head. It's like, I love the idea of America. And I love that this idea is supposed to reach its 250th birthday this year. And we can celebrate that. But I'm very disappointed in the United States. And being able to separate those two it was like a moment of reconciliation for me. Like I was able to actually understand what it is that I was feeling. And one thing that I'm wondering about is these dueling twins, this concept that you wrote about. How does that frame what we think of protest nowadays?
Well, you could look at it from the standpoint of those people who are expecting the freedom, are protesting the oppression that comes from empire building and capitalism.
Yeah.
And so that, or people who expect capitalism are angry that they're not able to do everything they wanted to do because they want the freedom to make as much
Mm.
money as they want. And if that means trotting on other people's freedoms, that should be fine too. So even the idea of freedom brings about protests, because whose freedom? How far do these freedoms go? And the freedom, the US Constitution, which was drafted in 1787 and ratified in 1789, the Bill of Rights that we think holds our protests elements and protections in 1791, when it was ratified, that even that Bill of Rights was created to give the people rights against the government they had just created with the U.S.
Mm.
Constitution. So it's a conflicted history from the very beginning. And so coming into this 250th anniversary, we're seeing the bully billionaire, or now probably trillionaire, capitalist twin, in power, and it's causing conflict because people are saying, well, where are my freedoms? You're oppressing me. And so you see now the rise of protest. And so that's why in my book, A Protest History of the United States, I want to show why people protest. Like, what are the issues of their day? What was the promise made they don't feel is being kept? And when you have these two conflicts going back and forth, there's always going to be protests because somebody is always going to feel they're cheated out of their promise.
I had, as I said, a few guests that have come on, and we talked about the 250th anniversary of America, but I've also had other authors come on and they discussed the book bans. And specifically, one of my guests that I had on, he writes the most beautiful children's books. And he's based in Florida, and his books are, Rob Sanders is his name, and his books are placed number one. He's the number one most banned author in, I believe, the state of Florida, and he's one of the top banned authors in the country. And we were talking about how when these books are being banned, just talking about it is an act of protest, and how our idea of protest, people just think it's marching on the streets, it's boycotts, but really it's this idea that's so much bigger than that. And so I really want to lay out, before we get deeper into the conversation, what is protest? What is peaceful protest? Because when I'm watching the news and I'm seeing these marches and what Republican Congress people might call a riot, I'm like, well, that's a peaceful protest. No one's getting hurt. They might set a car on fire, but they're doing what it takes to get media attention in their city to protest ICE, for instance. So I just would like to level set and understand, when we have the right to protest with our freedom of speech, what exactly is a protest? What is a peaceful protest? And what are the different forms of it?
Well, let's start off with the definition of protest. The word protest is not in the Constitution.
Mm-hmm.
We get our protest rights from the First Amendment, and most people think it's freedom of speech and freedom of assembly. That makes up the ways to protest. But the last line of the First Amendment says that we have the right to petition the government for a redress of grievances. For me, that's the core of our protest. Petition is to ask. A right to a redress is to fix. A grievance is a complaint. So we have the last line of the First Amendment that says we have the right to ask our government, demand it, that they fix what we are complaining about. And we can do that through freedom of speech. And that speech could be written speech, spoken speech. It could be symbolic speech. We could assemble in many different ways. I'm still wondering when we're going to look at people gathering together on the internet as freedom of assembly. That's a legal question that I'm looking forward to someone raising sometime in the near future and going to the U.S. Supreme Court and defining assembly, because we really haven't defined assembly in a long time. So when we're looking at protests, people are speaking out. They are deciding there is something that's going on that needs the attention of a corporation, of their building, their job, the government, state, local, or federal. How they bring about that attention meant that I had to expand the definition of protest. And I expanded it because, yes, and I give all props to people who protest in the street. I've been one of those people. I hope to continue to be one of those people into the future. But when people actually, as I start off with the indigenous, survival can be protest. When the act of genocide is being used against a group of people, that stand to say we are going to live no matter what, we're going to protect our heritage, our culture, our language, no matter what, can be a form of protest. So when you think about Rosa Parks not giving up her seat as a form of protest, but you don't think about Rosa Parks with a sign in the street. Yeah. And so all these different ways in which protests can happen, but the speaking up, I think, in whatever manner it may be, in that has been expansive when it comes to law. When I first started working on A Protest History of the United States, I wanted it to be a legal argument to support protests because I had heard so many people downing protests as not working. But then I realized there are so many protests that take place without any legal case connected to them. So then how could I limit it just to what the law says protest is? Yeah. So once you expand protests to be so many things, you realize that protests are going on throughout, our country all the time in the traditional as well as the non-traditional ways. So I think the speaking up in my book is speaking up in the advancement of social justice is the way that I'm looking at protest.
Yeah. And another part to this book that I just find fascinating and poignant, on top of the history that we learn, it's very personal for you. You write about your great great grandmother. You talk about your father and growing up, with him being in a union. You talk about the march that you led in Montgomery, to protest the Iraq War. It's a very personal book for you. And your great great grandmother, Eliza, she was enslaved in Kentucky. And you discussed how she was beaten and abused by her captors. Um, and she threw boiling water on them, and they never touched her again. How Talk to me about how that is a form of protest and how that kind of encapsulates how people are protesting, and we might not even see it. It might not fit the definition that we have in our head, but it's still a form of protest that furthers a mission and a cause that can later be realized.
I, I'm so honored to have Eliza as my great great grandmother. We trace our family line back to the late 1700s. So we've been in this country for a while.
Yeah.
And Eliza, born around 1827, is a story that also made me expand this idea of protest because it made me realize that her protest against her slave masters would not be something that had a case that would be written up in the court system.
Yeah.
It would be something that would probably happen in different forms in many different plantations around the
Yeah.
country. And people did many things that were ways of having individual protests. So I wanted to show that and let people understand that their ancestors as well probably had some form of protest that gave them the freedom or the sense of self. Some people might have lived, some people didn't, or some people were assaulted more. She lived through this, and was able to tell her granddaughter, Maddie, and have Maddie actually write the essay about Eliza and have that published in her college newspaper in 1907 when Maddie went to school, to college. And that's another protest. Here are people being told that they can't learn this, that. So you have all of this happening. But even Maddie writing the story as a form of protest to say, you will remember that this person existed. You will remember what you went through, and you're not going to let it be covered up just because slavery ended. So we have these small but very powerful forms of protest that I feel made me want to step out of the shadows as a researcher because it was very uncomfortable just to
Yeah.
talk about my personal life in my family's life and other things. But I felt families have protests in their family history,
Yeah.
and that should give them the courage to know that they too can stand up, and as well as think of with pride the protests that their ancestors did to get them to where they are today. To For people to be where they are today, somebody in that family line protested in some way.
And that's such an important word that you just said, uncomfortable, because I feel like there are so many pieces of our history, of our ancestry, that feel uncomfortable, and that keeps people from learning it. And it's almost a disservice, I feel like, to someone into our history to allow our discomfort to keep us from doing the work to learn and to further their message and their mission and to educate others. That discomfort, it being uncomfortable, is so important to that learning process. And as I said, your father was a machinist, a union machinist. He went on strike. You led the first anti-war march in Montgomery, Alabama. So this isn't just, you're not just writing about history. You lived this, and you're writing history from your perspective. You are living history. How did that feel, writing this from that perspective?
It was very awe-inspiring to
Yeah.
know my little part of life is just a very tiny story. Uh, When I think about my ancestral cousins who traveled from Kansas as women to Georgia to attend Spelman in 1919, 1918, 1920. And this is very important because in 1919, we had the Red Summer, where there were so many attacks on Black people and so many race riots, riots against Black people's progress. And Georgia was only second to Mississippi in the number of lynchings. And yet these women traveled by train and horse and to go to school in Atlanta because they wanted to go to Spelman College
Yeah.
and they wanted to be teachers. And that was a protest against, these Black women who didn't want to fit into a box and just be domestic servants. They didn't want to be just housewives. They had goals and ambitions, and they stood up at that time. And that was 1920. Women had just gained the right to vote that year in 1920. And here they are traveling across the country to go someplace in the deep South that was so dangerous. So my story is just a very small part of people who are far more courageous than am I.
One thing that I learned reading this book, and I mean, I'm always upfront about it. I went to a private Catholic school in Montgomery, Alabama. So after I had that education, a lot of what I learned was on me, trying to learn the things that were kept from that education that I received growing up. One of the things that I learned from reading your book was about the slave Bible and how there were certain aspects of that Bible that were kept out from being read by those who were enslaved in our country. Things of equality, liberation, fighting back, any of those verses, they were cut from the Bible. And I believe it was the standard Protestant Bible was almost 1,200 chapters, and the slave Bible had a little over 200. Why? Why? And I think I know the why, but for my audience, what is the end goal of keeping those things out of the Bible when we're looking at the American slave past? I think there are echoes of that kind of censorship that's happening today. Why would they leave those parts out of the slave Bible?
Thank you so much. You're the one of the first people to ask that question because when you think about slavery, it's this idea that this is not just a man-made system. God wanted this system. That's the idea that this is beyond us. We're just following the path that God has already set. And here in the Bible, then, if it says that, people have the ability to rise up, and as people will say, like even Jesus turned over the tables, at a certain
Yeah.
point, the sense is you don't want to give enslaved people who wanted to be full Christians, even those people who were enslaved wanted to be full Christians. You didn't want to give them in the Bible any support that they too were equal human beings and should rise up if they were poorly treated. No stories, anything that would actually give them a sense of self. And when the 20 and odd Africans arrived into the Virginia colony, that 1607 colony, in 1619, 20 and odd Africans arrived in that colony. They had been baptized, many of them against their will, in Angola. That's where they were from. When they were kidnapped from there and taken onto a ship. And so this whole idea of religion is interwoven into slavery, throughout slavery. When those Africans were in the Virginia colony and they wanted to practice Christianity, some, not all, because some were Moorish, actually. And the idea was if we have under law a prohibition against enslaving a Christian, then how are we going to have these perpetual servants? So they have to get around that. And so you see the way that the Bible is manipulated so that people don't know what their rights are. They don't know what the
Mm.
real words are. They don't know the true stories, and they will go along with what they're being told. So even today, the idea of what if knowledge is power, why are you hiding knowledge? Because they feel that knowledge will empower. And if knowledge empowers, it also leads to questions. Why are you doing these things to me? And what support do you have for them? And isn't it just pure greed and self-centeredness? And those questions then turn and become the support of protest. And they motivate people to rise up. And they didn't want people to rise up. So they said, well, just take all these things out of the Bible, or as today, let's ban all these books so we don't have the information necessary to start planting the seeds of discontent that would lead to protest.
It is so crazy to think that something from that long ago, and I say that long ago knowing that it actually wasn't that long ago when you look at the timeline of our country. Um, but just looking back and seeing just even the slave Bible and then looking at similar things that are happening today. It is so crazy to me that religion is still being used in a way to control and to suppress, that is being used as the basis to withhold information, to control education. And like it
Mhm.
is, that is so, like, I'm almost at a loss for words how crazy that is to me. And you kind of already answered my next question, because I wanted to know what happens to a person in a country when a history is fully realized. But it's becoming very evident to me that when our history is fully realized, when people have equal access to all information, change can happen. And what they're trying to do is to suppress change from occurring in this place. They want the status quo to remain the same.
And that breeds protest because even though people in the status quo, let's so for example, when it comes to labor unions, the companies might say, but this works out well for us to have you work 15-hour days. Why should we change this? What is it that you want is not the question. It's what the status quo, the elite, to whomever is in positions of power, is what they want. And so if there's control of information and people don't know, there's always this sense, and this is the other thing that I found, this sense inside that human being, even if they were given the slave master's Bible, even if they were not told at all that they had any rights, if they were not told they had rights, if they were told they were less than a human being, something inside the human spirit will say, I don't believe you.
Mm.
This is what's amazing about the human being, the human spirit, about any living thing. It wants to live. And once it sees any living thing, that crack of sunlight, it's going to rise up. They are going to want more. Then they're going to demand more. And when they see other people with things, and they're like, well, why can't I have that? Why is my life so dismal? Why am I supposed to do? That's why religion plays such a certain role, because instead of saying, well, it's not me saying it, God said, you should be second to me. God said, the woman should be beneath the man. God said these things. Therefore, there's nothing we can do about it except follow what God has already told us. And
Yeah.
so that's why I think depriving people of education, depriving people of information, as they deprive people of education, as the enslaved deprived them of education. So they couldn't read the Bible for themselves. They would only be told what was in it. So even now, you think about people banning books. They're banning books because they don't want young people to know what's in the books. And then they'll just tell them awful things are in the books. So that's why we don't want you to read them. And so they never have a chance to find out for themselves. They never have a chance to develop their own critical thinking and their own ability to see that crack of light in the sky. But young people and other people are going to want more information, and they're going to find ways to get it. And that's why no matter how oppressive people can be of the status quo, there are always going to be people who are going to break through to that ray of light.
Wow. Just wow. That, as I said, I had Rob Sanders on the podcast, and what you just said reminded me of a story that he told in his episode. And he wrote a book called Pride, and he wrote a lot of other books where some of the main characters were very diverse in their sexualities, how they identify, uh, trans characters, some were gay, historical figures. He's written them all. Um, and he had a student who a third grader who was struggling with their identity, and they read his books, or they read one of his books, and they felt like they were seen. And then so they read a second book, and then they felt empowered, and then they read a third book, and they knew that it was okay to be themselves. And that student wrote him a letter, and so he continued to send them books to say thank you, and here's more. um but it just, that what you just said, and then the story that he told months ago on the podcast, just really ties together the power of information, the power of books, the power of education. It allows people to be fully seen, to be heard, to feel recognized, to know that they have it within themselves to be the best version of themselves that they can be. And that's a very powerful thing. And so just knowing this history, how far back it goes that you're teaching us,
Mhm.
knowing real current stories from authors who are having their books banned. I mean, what a full circle moment for this loop to be closed right now for me and my audience.
Well, as we talked about, this is a United States empire building moment. This is that this twin you can see it clearly that the twin that's into mercantile and commerce above all. And not saying you can't have some freedoms at the same time, but when that mercantile twin is in full force, then look, as I say in my book, look for the protest because it will surely come.
What I'm curious about now is something that we've already discussed earlier on, but I want to dive a little bit deeper into it. How you call this a historical toolkit for the people who are protesting right now.
Mhm.
And I'm curious from your standpoint, what from this moment when you started writing the book to when it was released, what moment made you feel that this was urgently needed? Was it one thing and like a light bulb went off and you're like, I have to do this? Or was it just a lot of small moments over time where like that this would be needed right now?
When I first started, it's titled "The Protest History of the United States Now."
Hmm.
That title changed and the structure changed, ebbed and flowed. I knew I needed to write a book that spoke in a way of storytelling. Initially, as I said, it was going to be a legal history of protest because my other books, this is my seventh book, and my other books had used literature and in law together, and I wanted to do this in a way that was more like storytelling.
Yeah.
But I couldn't figure out the exact structure. And so the structure at first was chronology. And then I thought, oh, this is sounding too encyclopedic. And so I needed something to actually speak to the people who did not believe in protest,
Mm.
and yet at the same time pay homage to those people who had protested. I wanted those two things. That was very powerful for me. So that meant I had to have the stories of people who had protested, like Fannie Lou Hamer, like Tom Hayden, like Prince Hall, and Ida B. Wells Barnett. I had to have those stories in Elizabeth Freeman, but I also had to be able to do it in a way in which my audience could like the story of this, not just the law of it, not just the incident of it. And so I felt I had to then include memoir so that they would see that you could be a regular person and do this, that these were regular people. And that's how I included family. But this book took me over 10 years to write because I was also working on another book at the same time. She Took Justice, The Black Woman, Law, and Power, which is also storytelling using law, but in a clearer, more direct way using law.
Yeah.
This one I wanted, if I could, for people to see themselves in one of these stories, many of these stories, feel that empowerment and know that I too can do something. I don't have to be, you have so many stories like Martin Luther King and people like, I can't be Martin Luther King. And so, well, maybe you could be Eliza. Maybe you
Yeah.
could be Maddie. Maybe you could be Berdia. Maybe you could be one of these other people who did their small thing, and that also made a big difference.
I love that you said that. My audience is rolling their eyes right now because they know what I'm about to say, because I talk about it in almost every single episode. And it's this idea of getting involved in your local community. We look at what's happening nationally. And I promise you, I say this in every episode. I try to tie it in. Sometimes I don't have to, like you just did it naturally, and it always comes up. But when you look at what happens on the national level, it seems really overwhelming. How do I get involved? How do I make a change? And it's like, well, you're looking at the White House, you're looking at what's coming out of international news. Like that is a hard jump to make. But if you can get involved in your local community, if you can start getting volunteer time and with your local shelters, you can make an impact in your community locally and that it can then grow. So it's always such an important distinction to make that you have these amazing, really larger than life figures who can inspire you, but you don't have to be them. you can make your own impact in your own way in your local community, and it's just as impactful. And that's a way that you can fight back against how overwhelming everything is at such a large level, and know that you do have control over certain things in your more nuclear life and family and community. So that was, I'm closing the loop on that thought that you just made too, because it applies. But one thing that I want to talk about that you bring up several times in the book is how protests through the years, how it's a pattern, how a lot of what's going on, you can put a pattern to it. You can understand what's going to come next, what it takes to actually make the change that's needed. And from your perspective, and I don't want you to, I'm not asking you to be like a sidekick or anything, but based on the pattern that you've seen throughout history and where we are as a country right now, what happens next? What should we be doing next to really fight? And that question's rooted in fighting back against the authoritarianism that we're seeing coming out of DC and the rule of oligarchs in our country. Based on those patterns, what comes next?
Well, as I said, I usually write books that have their basis in law, and the protest history of the United States has law in it. But I wanted to show what's called a pattern in practice. That's a phrase that's a law phrase, to show the pattern in practice. And the pattern in practice over centuries of time, and most of my books are over centuries. Here's my point. What I've seen basically is that starting even with the indigenous, and they are the original protesters, you see the incursion of people who are trotting on rights. You see the pushback by those who are fighting for their rights. And you see this pattern in practice of things becoming violent. And I hate to say that, but that's the pattern in practice. Because what's going to be required that hasn't happened yet is disruption. And so even when you look at, for example, the women's movement, starting with 1848, if that's where people want to start, in Seneca Falls in upstate New York, it took until 1920 for women to gain the right to vote. And they were fighting for it this entire time. They protested, but at certain times they were arrested. There were hunger strikes. They were force-fed. There were abuses that took place. When you think about what happened for us to get even the 40-hour work week, you see that there were laws signed into law, the 40-hour work week and 8-hour work day, in the 1800s. It didn't come about until the 1900s. There had to be protests. There had to be pushback. There had to be strikes. And then there was Haymarket, which was an explosion that took place in Chicago. There's always been this element of violence. And I'm going to go to a question you asked previously about protests. Protests can be nonviolent. Protests can cause violence. Protests can draw violence. The nonviolent protests that we think of Dr. Martin Luther King, Bayard Rustin, Mahatma Gandhi, means that people intentionally are not bringing protests bringing the protests to start violence. And they're not going to respond if they are assaulted with violence. So this is something we don't really think about. A nonviolent protest means you're not going to be violent in the beginning. And even if people are violent against you, you're not going to be violent against them. That's why it was so unique, because most protests include violence at some point. Because people, the status quo and others, get so upset by how dare you say that the status quo is not good enough for you? How dare you say this war is wrong? How dare you say these women deserve the right to vote? And they will come out of their homes in order to foment violence against protesters. Protesters, even if they're there nonviolently, many of them will respond with violence because they don't have a nonviolent philosophy. And it's not their philosophy to be there. They're be there and take assaults when they are supposed to be protected by police. And sometimes law enforcement is part of the violence against protesters. Yeah, so when you start thinking about violence has been a part of protests from the very beginning, and violence is still a part of a nonviolent protest because the people who are there to act nonviolently are having violence, assaults against them. So violence is there. Just because you call it a nonviolent protest doesn't mean violence doesn't happen. People are treating the protesters with violence.
Hmm.
The protesters aren't even responding with violence. Those sit-ins, you saw people, students, dragged from their seats during the sit-ins in North Carolina and beaten. They did not respond with violence, but violence was, something that happened to them. They were the goal, the object of violence, and the goal was to create violence at the protest. So when we need to understand there are those who are waiting to create violence, even at a nonviolent protest. And then, as you pointed out, that's what makes the news. As they say, if it bleeds, it leads. So you could have 100 nonviolent protests where nothing happens of any violent nature, and yet have somebody begin to foment violence at a protest that will make the news. And then that will draw the attention and say, see, your protest is a violent protest. But the protesters never acted with violence. It's the people who decide that they must stop a protest from happening because they just resent the fact that protest is happening. Also, you have people who are propagandists who want to paint the protesters as the violent ones. They want to paint the protesters as wrong. And so you'll have them actually make up lies like the protesters are paid or the protesters, created the act of violence. But there's always somebody within a protest. And that's why I tell people don't protest at night, because you can't control your protest at night. And somebody could infiltrate your protest and start a violent act. And it could be people outside of your protest who want to paint the protesters as violent. So I'm concerned because rallies are created to help people come together and feel the spirit of commonality, of cause. But rallies are there for the people to get ready for the protest. A protest can disrupt without being violent. And I say that again, a protest can disrupt without being violent. So a sit-in disrupts business, as you saw with Home Depot and people buying the ice scraper in Home Depot as an act of protest. 100 people buying a $1 ice scraper in Home Depot, clogging the line of business, and then returning that ice scraper to protest against ICE by buying this ice scraper. So that was a creative way to protest. There are people who could protest by blocking traffic. That doesn't cause violence. That's not a violent act. Now, people might say, I'm going to beat up the protesters because I need to get to work and they're standing in my way, or I resent the fact that they are saying something I don't like, which happened during the Vietnam War protests. There were many people protested who were beaten up during the Vietnam War protests because regular people did not like with the speech. And that's why that speech is protected speech under the U.S. Constitution. So I'm concerned that the rallies, and we have a No Kings rally coming up on March 28th, and other rallies, No Kings rallies and other rallies. What is the goal and what is the act of disruption that's going to get the attention and also cause the status quo to become uncomfortable with oppression? If the status quo is comfortable oppressing, it's going to continue oppressing. How can we get, and if we're dealing with the bullied United States capitalist system, how do we get the capitalist system to take heed? It could be a boycott. A boycott disrupts. A boycott is not violent, but you have to have some key disruption. And to look to the future, these protests are going to draw out many people who want to create violence, to undermine the protesters, to lie and say the protesters are paid, to undermine the credibility of protesters. And they're going to be willing to create acts of violence to do this. And that's what I see in the future, that things are going to get violent and it's going to become a much more dire situation for many people as they begin to reassess this authoritarian regime. An authoritarian regime, a dictator is known for violence. Yeah. And as we see with ICE and the covering of faces, no names, that this authoritarian regime will use violence in the future to stop protests because they dislike being told they're dictators. They dislike being told they're wrong. And they believe that everybody should just be quietly oppressed. And people who are not going to be quietly oppressed will be used as examples to keep others from coming out to protest as well.
Gloria, there was one part in your book that really stood out to me, and it's in line with the violence being used against protesters. And I didn't take notes on this part, but I'm trying to recall from my memory, so I'm going to need your help. There were coal miners. It was either West Virginia or Kentucky. Was it West Virginia?
West Virginia, yes, West Virginia.
So the coal miners it was a strike, right? Against so it was a strike for of coal miners in West Virginia, and it was the government's willingness to leverage military against them. And I believe they were planning to drop a bomb on that mine, but the only reason why they didn't was because of bad weather. I hope I
They
just recalled that correctly.
Well, it was West Virginia, and I traveled to Mequon in West Virginia. It was a town that still has these giant bullets. I can't believe they're like this big, lodged in the side of brick buildings from the gunfights that used to happen between the people who were the workers who wanted unions and those people who were the union busters and
Yeah.
those who worked for the corporations and coal mine companies and the railroad. And so, yes, and the word redneck, the word redneck actually comes from these people battling, and they would say, "Well, how do I know who's on which side? How do we know who the workers are?" And they actually wore red handkerchiefs around their necks, and that's where the phrase redneck came from, was during that time period. And so, so yes, and so here's what else happened: those battles that took place because they did not want the workers to unionize. They didn't want them to come together and demand a fair wage, demand better working conditions. They had these yellow dog contracts that said that if you even talked, if a coal miner talked to a union representative, they could be fired, and then they would be evicted from their homes. They couldn't even go to church. They would have tent cities. They got rid of the tent cities because they said the land the tent is on in the middle of winter belongs to the coal mine corporation. And so therefore you can't even have a tent here. So when we talk about the harm that came, and the sense that these shootouts that took place between the two sides, and the act that the government would play in trying to side with the corporation to keep the coal going without thinking about the workers. They were also considering, because they're not too long before, after that happened, we have, like, well, before that we had what happened with Greenwood in Oklahoma, where there was the use of aerial bombardment of tar on top of burning homes to start fires, or pouring on homes to start fires. So this idea of an aerial bombardment was something that was close to the hearts and minds of those people who were standing up for themselves against corporations. So they were afraid that there would be an aerial bombardment. But yes, the sense that planes would be used was a real fear during that time period.
It's just crazy to me the lengths that corporations and the government will go to try to work against protesters, to frame it as the protesters are the violent ones, when it's often them, the other side, that's willing to resort to violence. That it is so crazy to me. And what's even crazier is that you brought up a few moments ago how indigenous people, that was like the first protest. One thing that I thought was really, really poignant, and the entire book is poignant, but one thing that I thought was just really interesting was how in 1823, the Supreme Court ruled in Johnson versus McIntosh that indigenous people never legally owned land because they had no European deed. And then you saw the Trail of Tears follow. And it was the fact that this institution that we're supposed to trust, that we think is just inherently good because it's in the Constitution, that because they're peaceful and they speak in a certain way and they're tied together with our rights, that we should just trust the Supreme Court. And yet they're complicit, the silencing and the harm and the backlash against protests in America. Knowing that from over 200 years ago now, that it just does something to me, knowing that, like, always question authority, always ask questions. Just because they're a government institution doesn't mean that we can just take it at face value. We have to dig deeper and we have to understand the history behind what they're doing and what they've done in the past, to understand what the future might look like. That was eye-opening to me.
Well, you just paraphrased Sankofa. Sankofa is a Ghanaian word that means you have to know your past to understand your present, to plan for a better future. And it's based on the Sankofa bird that goes forward but looks backwards. So believe it or not, you just said Sankofa and what you're raising right now. The U.S. Supreme Court actually has done more harm when in the balance of its time than good for regular people. People had to protest their way into the Constitution. And that's why I said before, freedom of speech is in the Bill of Rights in 1791 when the Bill of Rights was ratified. Who had freedom of speech? Who actually had this? So, Martin Luther King would, of course, say again and again, we have to protest for our right to protest because certain people were supposed to even be allowed. How dare you stand up against this government? You should just be grateful, sit back and be quiet. And there's always this sense, well, if you don't like it here, you can leave. Well, as I said, my family line goes back to the late 1700s. Where is your family line? When I'm
Yeah.
hearing these people say you should, that who's ever complaining should leave. It's like, well, when did you get here? It's like,
Yeah.
so I, yeah. Also, this sense that the U.S. Supreme Court is seen as the court of Brown versus Board of Education, which was 1954, but it's not seen as the court of Dred Scott, which said, just like the McIntosh case. But the Dred Scott case was that a black man had no rights a white man is bound to respect, which was 1857. This is the same Supreme Court of the Plessy versus Ferguson that gave
Mhm.
us, legalized racism and separate but equal, which was never equal in 1896, that we're still living with in the consequences of Plessy versus Ferguson today. So we have this one little window of Brown versus Board of Education with the Earl Warren Court in 1954. But then just think, the Voting Rights Act is 1965. But we have the men gained the right to vote. Black men gained the right to vote in 1870. They voted, and in 1870, believe it or not, there were U.S. senators, there were U.S. representatives, there were, state, local, and federal Black men in government. You had all of this, and then it was wiped away. The very similar process going on right now, the purging of the systems that would tell you that these people of color never existed. I mean, if someone walked into this country today, would they believe that Barack Obama had 2 terms here? There is that systematic erasure that takes place. And so when we think about the US Supreme Court, we have to look at the balance. And the balance is, if you actually look at it over time, they've been much more conservative than they have
Yeah.
been liberal.
Absolutely. And just speaking of these rights and the right to vote, for black men and women, one thing that I learned in your book was about the suffragettes and how we think, the way we've been taught, we think that they were this group of women who were fighting for all women, but in reality, they were fighting for white women, and they were even placing their rights above that of black men. And that, I mean, again, eye-opening learning lesson for me, that even in something that we have learned has been was such a amazing outcome for women, it still excluded people of color.
And Black women, it's the reason why Black women are so politically organized today is because Black
Wow.
women became politically organized in the 1800s. So Sojourner Truth in 1851 in Akron, Ohio, gave that speech to white women saying, "Ain't I a woman?" Because like you're trying to get rights, white women, basically is what she's saying, from white men, but then you're excluding Black women. Also, a lot of these movements, we don't talk about the splintering, and the women's movement is one of those movements that had a lot of splinters. So you have, even in the 1800s, you have women splintering off saying, "I'm not about the right to vote, I'm about the temperance movement. We want to stop alcohol in families. We think alcohol is undermining families." And they had the political power to create prohibition. their influence was enough. They couldn't vote during that time, but their influence was enough to create prohibition. So when we start thinking about the ideas of Black women, other women of color who were excluded by white women, um, and the exclusion that went on and during that time period led into a lot of conflicts that we have today. Even there are conflicts around the anti-war movement. There are some people that I think now, where is the anti-war movement? I've
Yeah.
met people. Howard Moreland is someone I interviewed around the anti-nuclear war period, a movement, the anti-nuke period. You don't even hear about that. And that's why in my book, A Protest History of the United States, I wanted to make sure that movements that were very much alive and well and had national attention at one time, and are highlighted because people forget about nuclear war. They forget about the sense of danger that we're all in when it comes to war until like the Iran war right now, which is such a concern, just like the Iraq war. These wars that people usually during the bully capitalist time period of the bully brother of the United States, deciding empire building, warmongering. That's something that comes very often that when we have the control of the country, the ideology of the control of the country in the hands of the bully capitalist empire builder brother, as opposed to, and I say this, and I know it sounds very sexist, the freedom, liberty, justice for all, symbolized by the Statue of Liberty. I just see these two fighting all the
Yeah.
time. This battle between these two twins, and but the last thing I'd like to raise on that point is that when we're looking at, this is a combination, when we look at where we're going next, we're going to have to see an economic, because this is a
Yeah.
capitalist country, an economic disruption.
Yeah.
So this, as I said, protest disruption can take many roles, but there's got to be an economic disruption because this country is a capitalist country, and that disruption can take many different roles and faces and ways in which it will be realized. But I think that disruption is going to be something that we see in the future as well.
And that just got my mind thinking because right now we see with the Trump administration what's going on with Iran and oil prices right now. Is there any world in which the government and their actions, I don't believe that they ever thought that gas would possibly be going as high as they're projecting it will go in the coming days, weeks, and months. So could that economic disruption be at the hands of what the government's doing and then people are then reacting to it? Does that economic disruption have to come from the protesters, or can it start with the government and then we just kind of pick it up from there? I don't know if that made sense, but
what happens sometimes, the government unknowingly triggers protests, because there was a time when gas prices were extremely high in the 1980s and then again in the
Mhm.
1990s. And you saw protests around gas prices because the truck driver, who might also be someone who has supported this administration, is going to turn around and say, I can't afford gas. And what you're doing is not in line with what I voted for. That person may now become a part of the protests. And you begin to see people who were not affected by the actions of ICE, not affected by the actions of erasure of African American history, or not affected by other layoffs that were taking place in the federal government, are now affected by something the government itself is doing. And now they are going to join part of the protest. And that's something when you think about a protest, and this is one thing I wanted people to realize, that
Yeah.
protesters have to inform people outside of the affected group. A protest has to be something that's informational. And the anti-war protests of the Vietnam War era, they were very great in having teach-ins. And the teach-ins would teach people, what are the issues at hand? How can I become an ambassador? How can I understand more so that I can help people better understand? The signs that people hold in the street should be informing people about what the issues of concerns are, not just to have like glib signs and that are cute, that's fine, but you also there to give
Mm.
that information to the bystander who's not at the protest so they can better
Yeah.
understand what are the issues that are taking place.
As we ran out this episode, there's just a few more questions that I want to touch on from your book as it relates to protest. And one of the stories that you write about is around Muhammad Ali. And I think his story is really applicable today because there's a lot of conversation going on speculating, is there going to be a draft? I know they passed legislation back in December updating draft laws about automatically enrolling 18 to 26 year
Registering.
olds. Yeah, the draft registration. Um, and back during the Vietnam draft, Muhammad Ali, he stood up to it. He didn't allow himself to be drafted, and that cost him his career during his prime. And it was only later, after his career was already impacted by his decision, that the Supreme Court vindicated him. But what does his story tell us about the personal cost of a public protest?
That's the other reason why I wanted this book to be written, to be read, because so many people whose names we'll never know sacrifice a great deal to protest to benefit us. And and one of the things that Muhammad Ali's, because it was a great recognition, I actually
Yeah.
saw him in an airport in Chicago and he gave me a hug. So that's my Ali story. But the sense that he was willing to do this. What do we value? What are our values? Are we
Yeah.
willing to stand up for those values? And for those people who are church going, those people who go to the synagogue, those people who go to temple, wherever you're going, um, what are your values? And are you standing up? One thing that I want to make sure people understand, and this is July 5th, I want to create Martyrs Day. And I want people recognized who no one may know, but somebody might have heard of, whose name has been lost in time. I can't put all the people in my book, or the book would be thousands of pages
Yeah.
long and no one would read it. But I want people in their communities across the country on July 5th. And July 5th is the day in 1852 that Frederick Douglass wrote his speech and stated it in upstate New York. What to the slave is the 4th of July? Frederick Douglass, a fugitive slave, Frederick Douglass, the statesman, the intellect, the advisor to Abraham Lincoln, asked this question. We need to ask ourselves, what is our freedom in this time of authoritarianism? And who are the people in our communities who have passed on but were protesters, community activists who gave of themselves and didn't receive the recognition they deserved, or maybe they received it in their time, but people have forgotten. So I think anybody could have a Martyrs Day on July 5th so that they could actually recognize those people in their communities, and you choose whomever you want from your community. But I think we have to start recognizing that protesters actually made this country great, especially on the 250th anniversary on
Yeah.
July 4th coming up. We have to recognize those people who did so much and they don't have any recognition. So people know who they are in their community. And I hope, because we have Muhammad Ali, people know that the sacrifice he made. There are other people who have made sacrifices, and I'm sure that Mr. Ali would want them to be recognized as well.
Absolutely. And that's such a great reminder too, because Frederick Douglass's words all those years ago, that I feel like that when we started this episode, when I was like, I feel conflicted celebrating the 250th birthday of the country.
Mhm.
I think that is exactly what it is that I'm feeling. It's like how are we celebrating when there are children being separated from their parents? There's families that are being broken. We see constantly breaking, the administration breaking the Constitution, testing its limits at what cost? At the cost of hurting people. And it's like, how can we celebrate when all of that is going on? And so the reminder for a Martyrs Day on July 5th to remember all those people who did the hard work over the years, that is
Yes.
such an important thing. And I will absolutely be pushing for that on my social media. Thank you for that. And that's a perfect closing call to action. And so with that, I want to ask you, Gloria, what is it that you're not wrong about?
I'm not wrong about the need to have strategy, tenacity, time, alliances, resources, and creativity in your protest to make it work.
Mm.
You need those things to make it work. Disrupt, disrupt, disrupt. Do so nonviolently, and we can push social justice even in this time of authoritarianism.
I Love that so much. As there is, as you said, another No King's Day protest coming up here in Alabama. We have a protest against Alabama Power. I'm going to have to fill you in on that at a different time. There's a whole thing going on with our energy company right now. But as we have these protests coming up, that is such an important message for everyone to hear and to recognize and to work towards having the resources and the organization and the strategy to make sure it's not just marching in the street, but that there is actually a lasting impact that comes from them. Thank you for that, Gloria. Thank you so much for your book, for your time, for joining us today, for your wisdom, all of it. I'm so eternally indebted to you for this time. This was like truly, this was transformational for me. Thank you so, so much.
Thank you. Thank you. And power to the people.